Chuck D of Public Enemy has famously said that rap music is CNN for black people. At least that's what he was saying at the end of the 80s and into the 1990s. The idea there being that when we get to the end of the decade, into the 1980s, as I said in the last video, there are all kinds of good business reasons why you want to create a range of different kind of rap music, because as it becomes a bigger and bigger sort of commercial entity, you want to be able to offer all kinds of different types to different kinds of people of different aesthetic preferences and that kind of thing. And so there is generally a kind of a branching out of approaches, and one of them is a kind of a realistic approach to what urban life really is. The kinds of problems that African American people have in their communities, what they think the roots of those problems are, who is still giving them trouble, how racism still exists in the culture, all these kinds of things. And one way to broadcast these problems in a world that doesn't really have a black news channel is to do it through rap. And so Chuck D's point there being that what you hear in rap is black people telling other black people what's going on in their communities. And so CNN for black people is a quote that has stuck for some of this more socially conscious rap. It also, the idea of, we've seen many times in the history of rock already, the idea of the good guys and the bad guys. Remember that back in the 1950s, in part one of this course, we talked about Elvis Presley kind of being the bad guy, the guy that you know, the mothers didn't want their daughter to go out with, and Pat Boone was the good guy. Maybe in the 60s we think about the Beatles as being the good guys, and the Rolling Stones as being the bad guys. Well, now we get to the late 80s, and it's possible for some rappers to be, you know, fun but relatively inoffensive and, you know, not so dangerous, and others to be a little bit more dangerous, a little bit more angry, right? You've got your good guys and your bad guys. And the bad guys during the late 80s were definitely the LA crew around gangster rap, and that was pioneered by Ice-T, based, as I say, out of Los Angeles. The song that most rap historians will point to is the song I'm Your Pusher from 1988, was number 13 on the black charts. Deals with urban themes, but in a more graphic and kind of angry way. It samples, by the way, Curtis Mayfield's Pusher Man from the 70s, and so the sampling of the Curtis Mayfield is an interesting kind of musical commentary on what's happening in the I'm Your Pusher song anyway. Another group responsible for the gangster rap is NWA, who created a lot of anger and controversy. The band featuring Eazy-E and Dr. Dre, who went on to become one of the most highly regarded artists in the rap industry. The anger and controversy I'm talking about comes out of an album from 1989 called Straight Outta Compton, Compton being a neighborhood in Los Angeles that's, you know, a very troubled sort of urban neighborhood. Number 9 on the black charts and number 37 on the pop charts. I'm not going to tell you the exact name of the song that caused all the trouble, but I will paraphrase the title of the song as "To Heck with the Police." Of course, that's not really what it is. You can look that up. The song was considered so angry and dangerous in some kind of ways that the record label actually got a warning letter from the FBI. Right? So clearly, these guys were shaking it up in ways that were in your face, that were aggressive, that were angry. They used funk samples drawn from P-Funk and Kool and the Gang, rather than the more sort of rock-oriented samples that Run DMC and the Beastie Boys did. When we think about NWA, maybe their biggest album was an album that I can't even really tell you the title of it, not because it's vulgar, but because if you look, it goes EFIL 4ZAGGIN, and maybe we can project this behind me so you can see what it is, but in order to read what it is, you have to read it backwards, right? Anyway, the album is from 1991, so a little bit outside of the time window that we're talking about, was number 1 in the charts and number 2 in the R&B charts. What's interesting is that, and we'll come back to this in just a minute as we wrap up our discussion of rap, as threatening as some people thought this kind of rap was, disturbing as parents thought it was, white suburban kids loved it. They just loved it. They loved getting this window into neighborhoods that they would never be able to go into, and it just, in many ways, it was almost voyeuristic and exotic in a certain kind of way. Not unlike the way white kids in the 1950s loved R&B. It was an opportunity to go into a neighborhood musically, culturally, that they couldn't go into physically, that they weren't allowed to be a part of. So this music was quite popular. We talked a bit about the social and political criticism. And coming out of the South Bronx, New York, Boogie Down Productions were led by Chris One, KRS-One. 1987, their album Criminal Minded, though it wasn't a big commercial success, is often thought of as being extremely influential for its sort of New York-based depictions of the harsh realities of urban life. Probably the group coming out of that part of the country that had the most effect was Public Enemy, and we've already talked about Chuck D, who was important in that group, and along with Flavor Flav. These guys coming out of Long Island, and not too far from the Bronx. In 1988, their album, It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back, is considered a real turning point in many ways for rap in terms of raising of social consciousness and awareness. Number 1 on the black charts, number 42 on the pop charts. And the big hit from that, Don't Believe the Hype, filled with all kinds of really interesting kind of sampling and various kinds of textures that aren't really, I mean, these textures have stopped being like band textures anymore. They're almost entirely constructed of electronic kinds of sounds in interesting kinds of ways and processing. Anyway, Public Enemy follows up with Fear of a Black Planet in 1990, number 3 on the black charts, number 10 on the pop charts. And the big song there, Fight the Power, number 20 on the black singles charts, was featured in Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing. And so there with that movie exposure, you get even more and even sort of broader kind of exposure of the music of Public Enemy. And finishing up our discussion of music here coming out of New York during this period, we should turn to the music of Queen Latifah, who comes out of Newark, New Jersey. And I know if you're from Long Island, Newark, or the Bronx, you see a world of difference between those communities, but to those of us in the rest of the world, they seem pretty close to each other. Queen Latifah's big debut album, All Hail the Queen, number 6 on the black album charts in 1989, and the big song from that, Ladies First. What's interesting about Queen Latifah is she raps about the pleasures of womanhood. She's out to prove that women can rap, and in a style of music that a lot of people would consider misogynist. You know, the ways in which women were used in rap music, especially in the videos that played on R&B. You know, a lot of people would say that women were objectified, they were demeaned in certain kinds of ways, they're called unflattering kinds of names and epithets, that kind of thing. That to have a female rapper come along and sort of stand up for the cause of womanhood and all that is an important moment. And so Queen Latifah is that rapper from the end of the 1980s. As I've said before, this week in the lectures, Yo MTV Raps debuts in 1988, August of 1988 to be precise. When it debuts, it quickly becomes the most popular show on the MTV schedule. A lot of people are now really getting turned on to rap music, and of course it has now very effectively crossed over to this wider sort of white middle class suburban market where suburban kids, you know, are going off to their Target or their Kmart or their Walmart and they're buying up these records that talk about worlds their parents would never allow them to be a part of. It's a kind of I guess, like I said before, exoticism or voyeurism, a way of looking into a community that you probably wouldn't be allowed to participate in if your parents had their way. There was a big controversy over rap, and we should take just a minute to talk about that. A lot of rock musicians at the time really hated rap in the same way that they really hated disco a couple of years earlier. Did they hate rap because it was so strongly associated with black culture? Well, we'd like to believe that that isn't true. And I'm sure there were certain people that it was true of. I mean, racism, we may be making important forward strides, but it's not eradicated. But probably the more important thing that rock musicians didn't like about rap is that it wasn't really about the performing artist. It was about the rapper, it was about the DJ, that kind of thing. But where were the guitar players? Where were the bass players? Where were the drummers? Where were the solos? You know, heavy metal was all about the musicians and, you know, the big drum sets and the posing on stage with the guitars and the virtuosic guitar solos. That's what was happening in one part of popular music in the second half of the 1980s. Another part, you've got music where there's everybody involved. There's maybe nobody involved even actually plays a musical instrument, but somehow it's called music because they're taking other people's music and recombining it, putting it together. Now, on the other hand, on the positive side of rap, most of those rock musicians didn't have a broad enough context to understand that classical musicians in electronic music had been doing this going really all the way back to the 1950s and into the 1960s. That is, taking sounds that were generated essentially by machines, synthesizers, or tape sounds, sounds that are processed through different kinds of filters and various kinds of things to create sounds that you may get, like you can go out and record car brake squealing and then put it through a particular kind of circuit to turn that into something else. These kinds of tape loops were used in Beatles songs during the 1960s, right? This kind of thing of taking sounds from the world around you and fashioning them electronically is something that classical composers had been doing for a long time. And it was certainly considered music within the classical world. So to not consider this what rap musicians were doing during this period of music is probably unfair and maybe a little bit narrow-minded. But what we don't really want to make a judgment. You make your own judgments on what you think about those arguments and all that. What we really want to do is just identify that there's an issue here. And the issue is one that keeps seeming to come back. This issue of white audiences, white rockers sort of bristling or rejecting some element, some musical style that comes out of black culture. Why that is, there are different explanations at different points in time, but it certainly is something that we see recurring going back to the 1950s and certainly happening already, or continuing to happen into the late 80s and the early 90s. Well, so far then, we've talked about these two parallel scenes. Heavy metal arising out of the late 1970s and the early 80s, having some success at the beginning of the 1980s, but then really having spectacular success at the end of the 1980s with big albums and MTV exposure and all that kind of thing, really pretty much on the main stage. At the same time, we see a parallel kind of thing going on with rap, which develops out of the New York scene around the Bronx and all that in the 70s, and then starts to sort of rise, and by the mid-80s, the late 80s, it becomes a very big kind of thing. So in many ways, and it's got an MTV show to go with it too. So in many ways, at the end of the 80s, we're looking at not only all of the other groups that we talked about last week, the Michael Jacksons and the Janet Jacksons and Prince and Madonna and all the rest of them that we talked about, but also we're talking about the rise now at the end of the decade of heavy metal and rap. But while all that's happening, there's other music bubbling along in the culture. And not all of it is on MTV, not all of it is on major labels, and not all of it is on regular FM commercial radio. Some of that music is part of regional communities where you can only hear the music if you go into clubs, not unlike we talked about the punk scene in New York in the 1970s. And some of it's happening in a place that really is off the mainstream radar, and that's FM radio stations on college campuses all across the country. So for the last bit of our lectures, the last couple lectures for this week, let's consider this underground scene around indie music, hardcore punk, and college radio, because it's this scene that creates the context that allows us next week to talk about the rise of alternative music and alternative culture as we move into the 90s. So we turn now to indie music in the 1980s.